Okay, so thank you for the introduction and invite, and hello everyone. It's great to see some familiar names and faces. So yeah, today I'm going to talk about Southwest Asian prehistory and some of the sort of wider implications for how we think about the human past. So I'm primarily going to talk about some recent research that we had published in Nature last month. And of course, it's just me presenting today, but this is very much the work of a large team. So, you know, I take this opportunity to thank all of my colleagues and co-authors. So today I'll talk a bit about this research, but also a bit on the background and the wider implications of this research. So firstly, why is Southwest Asia important? The key reason is, of course, the geographical location. Southwest Asia connects the rest of Eurasia to Africa. So if we want to understand the separation of hominin populations and species, their occasional contact and the migration of populations, it's a really important part of the world. But the only area which has seen sort of long-term concerted research is the East Mediterranean Levant. And this has produced some really important sites, but it is a very small area. And I think, you know, we have to be very careful about extrapolating from the Levant to Southwest Asia more broadly. Now, in the last decade, research has begun to be conducted more broadly. So there have been key sites published like Shibat Dia in Yemen and Jebel Faya in the UAE. I'll come back later to talk a bit about these sites. So the state of knowledge has improved, but it remains the case that we know very little about large parts of this region, and the areas that we do know are often quite atypical. So they're areas near the coasts or in sort of mountains and forests. And what me and my colleagues have been interested in is really understanding what's going on in these vast interior regions, which kind of dominate the region, but have been very poorly understood. So that's the kind of background to this research. Another way of looking at it is by the sort of later Middle Pleistocene, across the old world, we have this increasing kind of regionalization of hominin populations or species, some key examples of which are shown here. And we can think about these different species as being as forming meta-populations, so partially subdivided populations which were moving around and had variable kind of contact with each other. So this is the kind of model that people like Eleanor Sherry have been discussing in Africa, but also would have applied to other hominin species. And what's really interesting, I think, is that this basic structure is driven by major features of the landscape and of climate. So things like major water bodies and mountains divided the world into different kind of more habitable regions. And one of the, you know, in my opinion, one of the most interesting examples of this is the Sahara-Arabian arid belt. So this divided hominins in Africa from those in Eurasia. So understanding how human societies engage with these environments and how some groups were able to move through these landscapes is the kind of key topic of my research. And the record of places like Arabia is really fundamental to this topic. Another really interesting factor, of course, about Southwest Asia is the extremity of climate change in this area. So people often imagine places like Arabia today as being very arid. And this is, you know, in large part true, but in much of the past, the area was much more arid. So you can see on the left here, this is a model of precipitation in the last glacial maximum about 22,000 years ago. And you can see places like Arabia and most of the surrounding regions being almost entirely hyper-arid. But of course, there were other periods, such as the last interglacial, when this was very different, when places like Arabia had much higher rainfall, and this really transformed these regions. And this is important both in terms of how human populations migrated through these regions, but also I think there are profound insights into how human societies changed over time. So how humans adapted and responded to these dramatic climate changes. And I think places like Southwest Asia give us really interesting insights into this. So this is a figure from our recent paper summarizing knowledge on Southwest Asian prehistory. So this shows all dated sites between 50,000 and 500,000 years ago with either hominin fossils or stone tool assemblages. And as you can see from the particularly the small inset boxes, most of the sites known in this region come from the woodland area of the Levant. So this is a southwards extension of the Paleoarctic realm of northern Eurasia. And as you can see in the center, this is just a thin kind of coastal strip, which receives higher rainfall in the form of winter storms from the Mediterranean. Further south in Arabia, as you can see, there were just a handful of sites known. These are mostly sites that our team has published. But until recently, they were mostly either very small assemblages or they were sites with a single phase of occupation. And in this paper, we're talking about two localities marked here called Camphor and Jubba. And as you can see on the right, this is a climate model of rainfall in the last interglacial, so about 125,000 years ago, showing how during these wet phases, Arabia was transformed into this much wetter and probably grassland type environment. So a bit more just in terms of background. At the moment, the entire hominin fossil record of Arabia consists of this single fossil. This is the Al-Wusta 1 fossil. It's the middle finger bone of the middle finger. And although it's only one fossil, it's directly dated and is very taxonomically informative. So it's a very interesting find. But of course, it's just one data point. So when it comes to understanding the archaeology of places like Arabia, the human prehistory of places like Arabia, we're basically talking about archaeology, about patterns of variation in stone tool assemblages. And most of what has been studied are sites like this shown here. This is somewhere called Jubba that I'll return to later, basically surface sites. So typically where there are outcrops of good quality stone for stone tool manufacture, you find abundant stone tools. And in many ways, these are really interesting, but they of course don't have chronometric dates. And often they represent multiple sort of mixed phases of reuse. So the challenge has been how to build the archaeological record of Arabia, given this kind of character, given that things like alluvial formations and caves that have dominated the record elsewhere are not really found here. And this has been the challenge over the last few years. And in the last decade, there has been this quite significant increase in research on Arabia. So there were debates about the earliest phases of occupation. So some people have claimed there are Oldowan sites. I think this is currently unclear. So the oldest known sites have Acheulean technology, so things like hand axes. Then there's a very rich Middle Paleolithic. And then there's a lot of research on more recent periods, so into the Holocene, which I won't really touch on today. But I think a key point I'd like to kind of mention is that at every phase of Arabian prehistory, some of the same debates apply. So, you know, the extent to which changes were driven by migrations versus like local changes, indigenous changes within societies in the area. And as I briefly mentioned at the start, two key sites here were published in the last decade in the far south of Arabia. And what's really interesting is that both of these sites have a focus on basically localized technology. So they're broadly of a Middle Paleolithic character, but they're unlike other known sites from elsewhere in Arabia or in surrounding regions. And this was a really important finding because it showed that Arabia had this distinctive character, that we couldn't just treat Arabia as a kind of empty space on a map, you know, where people expected to find just kind of trails of stone breadcrumbs from neighboring areas, but actually that Arabia had this distinctive feature of the emergence of local cultural forms. And then in terms of paleoenvironmental background, there's been quite a lot of research done. And I think, you know, we now do know quite a lot. We know that there were these repeated phases of increased rainfall when much of Arabia was transformed into a sort of grassland. But there remain many questions on this. There were no kind of climate archives in many areas. Different climate models give different kind of results. So there are big questions such as how far north the monsoon moved, whether these winter westerlies across the Mediterranean, whether they intensified and brought rainfall to northern Arabia, and so on. So there's a lot of work still to do on this climatic background. So our team has worked all across Arabia, but in particular in the northern part, so the Nafud Desert. So this is basically the northern sand sea of Arabia, a vast area of very impressive sand dunes. And over the last decade, we've done various kinds of studies here, looking at sites of kind of every major phase of human prehistory. It's a really interesting part of the world to work in. This is an example of how these landscapes look. So this is from the top of a very large sand dune. And in the kind of hollows and basins between these dunes, we find hundreds, perhaps thousands of these ancient lakes. So these are the sediments remaining from these small ancient lakes that formed. And in about 3/4 of the examples of these paleolakes that we visited, we found archaeological remains. So these ancient lakes were real magnets for early humans. And also in many cases, there are lots of animal fossils. And these have formed the kind of backbone of the emerging record of the Arabian interior. Here's another example, Site Al-Athar, that we published last year. This is a lake dating to about 120,000 years ago. The key finding at this site were a series of human footprints, as well as animal footprints and animal fossils. But I think this quite neatly shows the kind of state of the art in that we make these findings, but we have quite a sort of disjointed record. So for example, at this site, we didn't find any stone tools. So we have a series of interesting sites, but how they fit together and what the kind of overall narrative of human prehistory was has remained unclear. So now turning to our recent paper, the key site we're reporting here is a site called CAM4, which you can see up here in the northwestern part of the Western Nafud. And we also supplemented it with additional work a bit further east, somewhere called Jubba, two sites called JSM1 and JQ1. So this is the site CAM4. It's a really interesting site. And as I mentioned before, we have many paleolakes, but they typically were always a single kind of phase, a single lake, and perhaps a single occupation. The thing with CAM4 is that at this same place, these lakes repeatedly formed. It's a really quite big site. You can just about see in the far background, that's Simon Armitage, one of our dating specialists. So basically, lakes formed here, each kind of wet phase. This is a kind of simplification. These remaining deposits are not the full extent of the lake, of each lake, of course, but this is just to give you an idea. So the oldest lake here formed about 400,000 years ago, and then subsequently at about 300,000, 200,000, 100,000, and about 55,000. And each time these lakes formed, humans were there. So around these deposits, we find abundant stone tools. So in this site, we have this currently unique record of these repeated hominin occupations in the area. And what's really interesting to us is that this allows us to hold some kind of variables quite constant. So each occupation is associated with a similar kind of landscape. So a small lake in a kind of grassland environment with similar raw material access and similar raw material being used. So we systematically surveyed the site. So we did transects across it, and then using both differential GPS and total stations, recorded every artifact and every animal fossil. And this produced hundreds of animal bones and thousands of stone tools. And this, it's just a really interesting site. I mean, one of the key observations we made is that aside from these stone tools and fossils, all the sediments are very fine grained. There are no kind of cobbles or gravels. Everything is very low energy. So there's no evidence that these materials are being kind of washed around or reworked. They really seem to be basically in situ human occupations, each of which relates to these distinct sediment bodies. And on the right, you can see some of the strat logs. So basically each of these different deposits are pretty similar. So they're basically an underlying sand and then an overlying marl formed within the lake. So we used luminescence dating primarily to obtain a suite of ages dating these different deposits. We also used U-series dating for the Northwest Lake. And it's also important to point out that in several cases, these different deposits partly overlap each other. So there's also a kind of relative chronology. So for example, the Northeast Lake partly overlies the Central Lake and underlies the Northwest Lake. So it's this combination of relative dating and absolute dating, which gives us very consistent narrative of the chronology of the site. So we can look at various aspects of these assemblages to explore how material culture changed over time. Here are some examples of that. So on the left, this is a map of all the hand axes found at the site. So you can see that aside from a single stray example with the Southeast Lake, hand axes only occur with the Central Lake and the Northeast Lake. So 400,000 with Central Lake and about 300,000 years ago with the Northeast Lake. Then in the middle, we have Levallois flakes. So we found a few Levallois flakes with the Northeast Lake, and then many more with the subsequent lakes, the Northwest, Southeast, and South Lakes. And we can do this kind of thing with various aspects of typology and technology, exploring how material culture was changing through time. On the right is another way of looking at it. So this is showing different kind of weathering. So the main kind of stone used at the site is this, what we call ferruginous quartzite or ferrocrete sandstone. So basically it's very old sandstone, it's Paleozoic sandstone that over time, iron moves through this sandstone and forms these iron-rich horizons. So when the rock is fresh, it looks like this flake at the bottom right. But over time, the iron basically leaches out. So you get this kind of banding effect at the top right. So this flake at the top right, this is about 300,000 years old from the Northeast Lake. And this flake at the bottom is about 55,000 years old from the South Lake. So we can see in these various kind of independent axes, these changes across time. Now, just to briefly walk you through these different assemblages. So the oldest is assemblage A. So this is probably just over 400,000 years old. This is a small but informative assemblage characterized by the manufacture of hand axes. So there's no core reduction technology here. It's just hand axes and associated flakes. This is the oldest dated site anywhere in Arabia at the moment. So it's a very useful kind of reference point. Then the next phase, assemblage B, is just over 300,000 years old. This is a pretty good size assemblage. So there are almost 80 of these small hand axes. And very interesting technology. So these small hand axes are pretty standardized. So they're small, they're typically pointed, they're quite elongate, they're quite kind of flat. So very interesting, small kind of late Tertiary bifaces or hand axes. But interestingly, in this assemblage, there's also a small prepared core element. So basically simple Levallois cores. And these cores don't seem to be about producing blanks for hand axes, because they're too small. They seem to be a separate reduction strategy about producing Levallois flakes, which is interesting in terms of debates about the origins of Levallois. Then the next phase is about 200,000 years ago. And this is perhaps a particularly interesting example. I've just shown on the left here how this lake looks. This deposit seems to perhaps be a bit better preserved than the others in terms of maintaining more of the actual shape of the original lake. And this is where animal bones were most abundant. So on the right, this is an oryx scapula that was eroding out of the ground. And there were just hundreds of fossils like this. So we selected this lake to excavate several trenches to explore our kind of idea about how artifacts and bones related to the different deposits. So this is an example of one of the trenches. And what's interesting here, you can see the basal layer is this sand layer, and you can see how it's very steeply sloping. So it's basically preserving the sort of ancient dune. And on top of this dune, lakes formed. And in these lake deposits, we found stone tools and animal bones, exactly as we'd kind of predicted from their surface distribution. And these are some examples of artifacts from this assemblage, so assemblage C. And unlike the earlier assemblages, there's a complete absence of hand axes. And now we have a very kind of classic Middle Paleolithic assemblage, which is the oldest Middle Paleolithic known in Arabia. So we have a focus on Levallois technology. So you can see on the left an example of Levallois flake. And on the right, this is a Levallois flake with the proximal part of a refitting Levallois flake. So this flake broke when it was being struck. And we have a few examples of refits, which again, I think are really interesting. And I think they show quite a consistent kind of use of the site. So people would bring clasts and cores to these lakeshore settings, make their stone tools, use them for something, and then perhaps take some lithics elsewhere in the landscape. Then there's assemblage D. So this is only dated by an underlying age. So technically we just have a kind of maximum age. So this is less than 150,000 years ago, but based on its technological characteristics, which is a very high focus on centripetal Levallois technology, it's very similar to other assemblages dating to about 100,000 years, so MIS5. And as I've shown here some examples of these cores, we find an increasing diversity of raw material types. So on the left, quartzite, the bottom right, chert, and at the top right, rhyolite. And for example, this rhyolite core, we also found a refitting flake, and all of the rhyolite at the site occurred in one small kind of scatter. So it does seem like these indications of very good integrity of these different assemblages. And then finally, at the south of the site is assemblage E. So this again is only chronometrically dated by an underlying date of about 150,000, which suggests the overlying lake and these lithics are late Pleistocene. And again, by comparison to the kind of wider regional picture, we think they probably date to about 55,000 years ago. They focus on these the Valois points, on this more unidirectional convergent preparation, which otherwise is known in the region at about 55,000 years ago. What's interesting is that elsewhere, further to the north, this kind of technology is made by Neanderthals. So this is a possible hint that Neanderthals were moving further south than previously known. So traditionally, they've been regarded as only really occurring in the kind of woodland zone of the Levant. This may hint at a further kind of southwards movement, but that is quite a kind of preliminary hypothesis. So this is just summarizing the this record of material culture change. And I think, to me, there are two key points here. Firstly, it's very interesting how between each phase we see a very major change. So there's no evidence of, I would say, of continuity of populations in this region. It more seems that each wet phase, groups move in, and then either die out or move elsewhere. Secondly, what's very interesting is that unlike Southern Arabia, where I mentioned these mostly kind of local characteristics, these North Arabian assemblages are repeatedly similar to those from surrounding areas. So from East Africa, Northeast Africa, the Levant, different areas at different times, but the point is repeatedly similar to surrounding areas, which to me suggests a picture of basically repeated movements into Arabia from the north. So that I'll come back to this, but there's been a lot of debate about the northern route across the Sinai versus the southern route across the Red Sea. And to me, this distinction between more local trends in Southern Arabia and more kind of comparable to surrounding regions in Northern Arabia strongly supports the northern route between Africa and Eurasia. So we've previously published the animal fossils from this site, but at that point we didn't have any chronometric dates. So it's interesting to sort of update this perspective. And I think there were, again, a couple of interesting points. So, for example, the Northwest Lake, the 200,000-year-old lake, this is where most fossils came from. And fossils here were things like hippos and elephants and ostriches. So typical kind of grassland fauna, but really showing the extent of climatic amelioration. And actually what's interesting is that we now have these hippo fossils dating to several different wet phases. And hippos, aquatically adapted, they need deep water to survive. So hippos are very sort of iconically show these repeated wet phases and just how wet they were. So that's the CAM4 sequence. To kind of supplement this record, we also did some more work a bit further east. So this is somewhere called Jubba. This is a much larger basin. So this is taken from the top of a quite large sandstone hill. And as you can see in the lee of this hill, there's a large kind of basin. And we've been working here again for a long time, and repeatedly in human history, people came to this sort of oasis and left a really kind of rich archaeological record. And what's interesting here is that lots of these sites are buried. So this is a kind of one of the rare places in this region that you can find buried stone tool assemblages. So the first site we looked at is a site called Jebel Qatar 1 or JQ1. We published some initial work on this site in 2012. So in a series of small trenches, we found a very small assemblage of flakes at a kind of consistent depth and context. So in this paper, we report much larger excavations. So we dug 2 huge trenches, and it's quite a frustrating sight because these lithics are very kind of fresh, some quite nice lithics, but they're very sparse. So we moved hundreds of tons of sand to find a few dozen very simple flakes. So there's one possible core fragment, no like retouch tools, it's just a collection of flakes. But I think it is important in that they do show a clear Middle Paleolithic character. So there were no hints from this site of kind of Lower Paleolithic technology. So this just confirms this indication from CAM4 that we have this Middle Paleolithic in Northern Arabia at about 200,000 years ago. The other site at Jubba we excavated is called Jebel Sanman 1 or JSM 1. And again, we reported this site in 2012. And in our initial work, we'd collected a surface scatter of lithics. We dug a small trench and hit bedrock after about 30 centimeters. So we had some OSL estimates from this tiny little trench, which were kind of all over the place, which is unsurprising given how shallow a trench it was. We went back subsequently, went about 5 meters away, and found in several trenches that actually the deposits were much deeper. So at least 2 meters deep. We didn't hit bedrock anywhere. And these sediments are full of hundreds of stone tools. And we have new luminescence ages, which basically show that the deepest parts of these deposits are about 130,000 years old, so early MIS5. The upper part is about 75,000 years old, and the stone tools are found in this upper part. So this is now the largest excavated assemblage of lithics for any site in Northern Arabia. And as is typical for MIS5 sites, they have this very consistent and particular kind of technology, which is a very strong focus on centripetal Levallois. And I think this is a really interesting kind of data point again. So this is typical of sites between sort of 125 and 75,000 years ago, but this is the youngest known site of that kind of group. So in terms of debates about when humans left Africa, for example, you know, geneticists will say that sites like Skull and Kafse, you know, they're too old to possibly relate to the peopling of the world. But 75,000 years starts to come within the kind of error range of genetic estimates. And these are kind of artifacts very similar to those being made in East and Northeast Africa at the time. So, you know, I suspect this shows the presence of Homo sapiens at this time, but the debate is always, you know, what became of these different groups. So those are the kind of new sites and new assemblages we identified. We then wanted to do some comparative work to explore, you know, how they compared to other regions. And this is for the Middle Paleolithic assemblages. And of course, there are big debates on how it's best to compare assemblages. So some people like to compare cores, which I partly agree with, but cores are just the kind of residual form. Some people like to look at retouched artifacts, but retouched artifacts are very rare in this part of the world. And, you know, and so on. So every category we could think about comparing often has these sort of limitations of sample sizes or of kind of theoretical limitations. So what we chose to do here was to look at the Levallois flakes. All of these assemblages we found are dominated by Levallois methods. So I think, you know, there's a good theoretical reason. These reduction in these assemblages was focused on making Levallois flakes. So these are the sort of designed elements. And also just pragmatically, there were big enough sample sizes to do some of these comparisons. And again, there are various different methods people can use for comparisons. We, as well as a kind of general qualitative analysis, we use principal components analysis. So this is just a good kind of standard multivariate approach where we condense lots of information to a smaller number of variables. So we use just a fairly standard series of metrics, so various lengths and widths and platform dimensions and so on, and then compared the findings to assemblages from surrounding regions. So this is the first analysis for the earlier material. So these are sites dating to about 200,000 years ago. So in the middle, we have assemblage C from Camphor that we've recently found. Then on the left, this is AHS from Omo Kibish in Ethiopia. And on the right, Miss Leah from the Levantine woodland. The first component basically reflects size, so it's not particularly interesting. What's interesting is the second component, which basically shows the different shapes of these stone tools. And what you can see is that Camphor from Northern Arabia falls halfway between East Africa and the Levant. And this is interesting. There's been a lot of recent argument about there being early Homo sapiens dispersals out of Africa at about this time. So from sites like Miss Leah and Apodema, it's been kind of debated. And perhaps what these results show is consistent with this idea that actually Camphor shows a kind of early Homo sapiens dispersal, and we can see a process of material culture changing along this dispersal route. And this is also consistent with observations on scar patterns and other features. Then for the more recent periods of the late Pleistocene, there's a lot more work being done. There's a lot more kind of sites known. So something we've kind of discussed quite a lot. So for example, it's known that Neanderthals appear in Southwest Asia at about 70,000 years ago, coming from the north. And they make this quite consistent kind of stone tool assemblage. Some examples shown here. So we have these more clear expectations about how different populations made their assemblages. So we compared our new assemblages with others from elsewhere in Arabia, from Africa, and from the Levant. And again, I think the results are quite interesting. So again, PC1 is basically size, so not particularly interesting. But again, the second component is dominated by shape. So it's basically contrasting parallel to oval-sided flakes, like on the left. This is from, again, from Omo Kibish, to these more convergently shaped Levallois points. So you can see sites with positive values from Africa and from Southwest Asia in MIS5 when Homo sapiens were dispersing, and sites with negative values like Kabara and Torfarage. These are Levantine Neanderthal sites. So then we can plug in our new findings, and I think quite an interesting sort of picture emerges. So JSM1 at 75,000 has these positive values, so fits this group of assemblages with links to Homo sapiens. Camphor assemblage D, a bit more subtle, but again has typically positive value, so probably Homo sapiens. Assemblage E from Camphor has negative values, so fits this idea that this may well represent this southwards extension of Neanderthals. So now moving towards some kind of discussion points and conclusion points. So I think what these findings show are these repeated kind of migrations into Arabia, into these generally arid zones during these occasional windows of increased rainfall. But I think it's important to think about the underlying kind of societal dynamics. How did these populations sort of move? And it's easy to sort of draw a big arrow on a map or talk about the out of Africa event, but actually it's more useful, I think, to really think about at a landscape scale how human societies may actually have kind of moved. This is an image from a paper I was involved in recently, led by Sam Nicholson, where we sort of propose a model for one possible example of how humans may have expanded out of Africa in MIS5. So this idea that within the wetter parts of Africa, we have this set of interlinked populations. And then as the monsoon moved north, these populations gradually spread, new populations bud off. And then over thousands of years, this leads human groups into these new territories, into Southwest Asia, into places like Arabia. And then when arid conditions return, these areas become uninhabitable and groups kind of contract to few areas like mountains and forests and so on that maintain better conditions. And I think it's probably these kind of processes which characterize how humans move into these areas. And likewise, in terms of the temporal aspects, one of the challenging things is that for these early time periods, age estimates have very broad error ranges. So, you know, a good OSL date might have sort of plus or minus 10% error. So it's very hard to be specific about timing. There's a few kind of ways partially around this. One is to use more recent periods as a kind of analog. So this image shows some lake records from Tamar in northern Arabia, and they show the last wet phase. So this is in the early Holocene. And this is not a perfect analog. The Holocene wet phase is quite a weak wet phase, but nevertheless, it's, I think, interesting to think about. And here you can see the humid phase lasts less than 1,000 years, and at its peak, perhaps a couple of centuries. And I think this probably applies to these Pleistocene wet phases as well. It's probably that in each case, there's between a couple of centuries and a couple of millennia of these wet conditions. So quite short, because the monsoon takes time to migrate north, and it's a short window by the time it reaches the far north of Arabia. So I think, yeah, we're looking at these very narrow windows when populations could move between these regions. So yeah, just a final kind of few discussion points. Just to summarize the findings we've made, I think what our findings show is that there's a key kind of dispersal route but from Northeast Africa into Northern Arabia. The implications of this for Arabian prehistory are that the peopling of Arabia was by these repeated waves from the north. And more widely, I think, in terms of world prehistory, these findings suggest, at least to me, that the fundamental connection between Africa and Eurasia is the northern route, the Sinai connection, not the southern route across the Red Sea. We just don't see any evidence in support of this Red Sea route. I would also like to emphasize this is not just about groups moving out of Africa. I've hinted at possibility that, for example, Neanderthals were moving further south than known. And of course, it's possible that in this time frame, there were human groups moving from Eurasia into Africa. So in summary, we're looking at these occasional kind of wet phases when we have these long distance migrations, but they're quite short. And then populations contract to smaller areas which maintain more amenable conditions. The kind of wider implications for human evolution more generally, I think this kind of work emphasizes a kind of boom and bust pattern to prehistoric demography that we have occasionally during these wet phases, populations expanding over big areas and then crashing again. And I think there is a problem in archaeology and paleoanthropology of most people working in a few small areas of the world. So I've shown a few examples in this map on the right. Most people keep going back to areas where, you know, stuff's already been found. And on the one hand, this kind of makes sense, but we have to recognize that the problems of this, that these small areas are not just small, but often they're kind of atypical. They're ecologically and climatically very different from kind of the major surrounding regions. And I think we have to try and have more kind of spatially representative sites if we really can understand these processes. So then finally, I think the challenge in understanding things like early migrations is finding the balance between the kind of climatic and ecological aspects and the behavioral or adaptive aspects. So I've talked a lot about how these migrations related to climatic phases, but I don't think we can kind of reduce human history to these climate phases. So for example, if we look at animals, animal species either side of the desert belt, so say the Levant and East Africa, they stay very distinct throughout this time period, which suggests that even during these times of increased rainfall, the Sahara-Arabian arid belt remains quite a challenging and arid area. So I think what we're looking at is a combination of climate change, but also evolving hominin abilities to cope with these challenging landscapes, different mechanisms to aid migration and so on. And I think this is why archaeology is really key to thinking about early migration. We can't just reduce it to kind of climate and biology. It's human societal adaptations, which I think are a really important part of these processes. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm always happy to chat with anyone and answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Huw. That was an excellent talk, and I'm sure we're going to have a very productive Q&A. So if anybody has any questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and ask out loud. Okay, so we have the question here, if you'd like to unmute, Mohammed.
Thank you very much. Very nice talk. And first of all, I'm not an archaeologist, so if anything comes up realistic when I speak, sorry for this. I'm actually a geologist, but I'm very keen on archaeological finding. I just want to make the point that in the southern side, southern and central part of Oman, actually, I'm from Oman, by the way, we've conducted loads of research on geological sites, including paleolakes, and also published a few papers on that recently. As a matter of fact, there are thousands, if not millions, of all of these artifacts, which are probably middle, Paleolithic, late Paleolithic, all the way to the Holocene, spread across the desert of Oman. You can't miss them, and in many cases there are caves which are where you see Paleolithic deposits and artifacts within these caves that have not been properly explored by, I would say, archaeologists in the past. Now, my question is, what is the likelihood that this dispersal is actually coming across the Red Sea somehow, and actually instead of spreading north to south, going south to north? And what are the interests? Also, this is a kind of second question I have. What the interest is to spend more time to correlate whatever data you have in the current research area you have with the areas in South Arabia, including Oman, for instance. And thank you again for the talk.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I've worked in Oman a little bit, so I'm doing some work there as well. So I think there has been this big debate about which routes people took. And, a lot of people have argued that crossing the Red Sea was this big kind of migration route. The original kind of idea for that, I think, really came from kind of genetic research, from people wanted a mechanism to make populations kind of move very fast. It's never been based on any real kind of evidence. And to me, if it was true, we'd expect to find very strong similarities in material culture between East Africa and Southern Arabia, which, in my opinion, we don't see. So for these repeated phases of prehistory, what we find in Southern Arabia and East Africa is very different. And there hasn't been a land crossing for millions of years. So even during lower sea level, it's still a very challenging crossing with strong currents and sharks and so on. So it's I'm not saying it's impossible people cross the Red Sea, but I just don't see any evidence for it. Whereas I think there is a lot of evidence for the northern route. So thank you.
And how about correlating the second part? Sorry to interrupt, but the second part of the question. Do you think there is more room of further research in the Omani side, the Paleolithic deposit?
Yeah. We're engaged in various kind of studies, some of which include sites from Oman.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the questions. Larry, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hello, Huw. Thank you for that. That was a really elegant use of principal components analysis. I really like that. But my question, I think, is a bit more focused on that late Acheulean material from assemblage A at Camp 4. Really interesting. You hinted there that it may contribute to our understanding of the development of Laval. Do you have any more information about any cores or anything that we can see where the Laval is coming? Is it coming from the small bifaces as an initial step before the production of Laval? And that's a very specific question, but it just feeds into a current interest. So if you could talk about that, I'd be grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. No, so that's assemblage B with the Laval.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's very interesting. So in the SI for the paper, there's a few drawings of some of the cores. So they're basically quite simple Laval cores. So not many kind of preparation flakes, but yeah, pretty typical kind of centripetal Laval cores. And because they're quite small, that's why I don't think they're ways to make blanks for hand axes. I think they're just a separate kind of strategy. They're not that many of them. I forget off my head how many there are, but there's enough that they seem to be a real kind of part of the assemblage. And they're the same kind of raw material, this kind of ferruginous quartzite. The problem with some of that assemblage is it's quite weathered. So some of the flakes are like very weathered. So it was quite challenging like some of the flakes may be Levallois flakes, but given how weathered they were, it's quite hard to tell. But I was more happy with the cores, so there's, and what that kind of means, I'm not kind of sure, but it is interesting, isn't it, that it does suggest Levallois is present kind of before a full Middle Paleolithic is present.
Thank you, Larry. Ahmed, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, hello. Thanks, Prof. Huw, for this wonderful talk. And about the Arabian prehistory, I have two short questions. The first part of the question concerning about the field work in Arabia of prehistory. I'm asking about the target areas, the landscape target area to finding Acheulean site and MSA site, and how it's different from the current landscape. And the second part of the question related to the lithic characteristic, stone tool technology and typology. And you talk about the Acheulean phase A and phase P, the KAM4 side. And are there the characteristic transition from A to B? And what about the LCTS, large cutting stone tools in Arabia, and how you can put this feature within between these two phases of before or the second? And may I ask one question about could you give more comment about the geomorphology of the prehistoric Arabian site now? There are some sites, did you think there are some sites completely covered by sand now, and some of them sediment, and how you could recognize this? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll answer them in reverse. Yeah, so one of the big kind of questions has been, how stable are these ancient dunes, for example, and are there some dunes kind of sitting on top of sites? We've done a bit of work with ground penetrating radar to try and look underneath these dunes. And it seems like in some cases there may be sites that are very kind of covered. It's a bit unclear, but with somewhere like Cam4, it seems like the big dunes either side have been pretty stable, and then just like smaller dunes have moved over the site, and they slightly change the kind of accommodation space. Yeah, I think in terms of the different Acheulean assemblages, at the moment it's quite challenging because there are not many assemblages known. So, for example, at Cam4, the oldest assemblage is quite small, but the hand axes are quite similar to assemblage B, but there isn't that kind of core reduction method. But then, for example, in our work at Dawadmi, this is Acheulean dating to about 200,000, and there's discoidal technology, but no Levallois technology. So at the moment, almost every kind of Acheulean site being published is different. So I'm not quite sure what that kind of means. And I think you know, a lot more work is kind of needed. So also excited to see the work that you and your colleagues are doing. What was the first question again? Sorry.
About the target area within the survey, within the archaeological survey.
Yeah. So yeah. So we've done, like, I say, quite a lot of survey over the years now. So I think we do have a fairly good kind of understanding of some of the basic kind of landscape patterns. And what's kind of interesting is that the Acheulean sites tend to be kind of on the edges of the desert. So they're very near the kind of stone sources, and that with the Middle Paleolithic, you start to find more sites kind of further into the dune field, which may suggest kind of, you know, more kind of mobility. But yeah, so that our preliminary observation is that Lower Paleolithic sites tend to be more close to the rock sources. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Should we have just one more from John, if you'd like to unmute?
Yes, hello, Huw. Sorry, my camera seems not to be connecting, but that's really been a great talk. It's lovely to see all that laid out in that way. Quite a lot of work was done in the Lower Nile, of course, around Aswan and so on. And I just wondered if your work in some way is helping to seriate that better, because there always seem to be so many kinds of Middle Paleolithic in that area.
Yeah, I think so, to some extent. And what's kind of interesting is that the main, like, raw material used is quite similar. So this kind of ferruginous quartzite or sandstone. The problem with a lot of that Nile Valley material is still there's often kind of poor dating of it. So that's, you know, a big limiting kind of factor. But certainly, for example, some of the younger sites. So in our PCA for the late Pleistocene, one of them was a site called ANW3. So this is one of these so-called hominin sites, which have been very kind of debated, and that the sort of age estimate of them has crept kind of older. And what our PCA showed was that, like, those sort of sites are very similar to kind of MIS5 sites everywhere. So to me, it was another kind of example showing how some of those Nile Valley sites do, again, show this kind of this northern route, this pattern of kind of similarities. But again, it's yeah, I think it shows without kind of good dating, it's very hard to make sense of this record. And yeah, there's still a lot to do in that sort of Aswan Nile Valley area, I think.
Okay, thank you, Huw.
Thanks, John. We do have another hand up if you're happy to take another question, Huw. I know it's we've sort of gone past the hour now.
That's all right.
Okay, if you'd like to unmute Jurate, I hope I pronounced that correctly.
Thank you very much for a really fascinating lecture. I just wanted to know, I understood, is this correct, that there was no indication of transport of source material, that all of the rock origin for the tools are local? Was that correct? There's no indication of trade or long distance material transport. Thank you.
Thank you. So most of the material is this sort of ferruginous quartzite, which is probably from within about 5 to 10 kilometers. So we don't know the exact source, but there are multiple kind of sources. Then there are small traces of these other rocks like chert and rhyolite. And we're not really sure where they came from. Because, for example, there are bedrock sources, but also there are kind of ancient rivers where people may have found in gravels these materials. But I think they're quite small amounts. So I don't think it's like trade or anything. I think it's probably more just that mobile populations might pick up a few small pieces of rock on the way. But overall, yeah, it's very local kind of stone.
Okay, thank you. That's really a fascinating lecture. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you very much for that question. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Huw, for the great talk, and thank you everybody for coming. And we'll see you all next week.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.